Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Roets. On this podcast, over the last few months, we have referenced several books. And on this YouTube channel on which this podcast is published, we have also had some live conversations about great and interesting books. And I'm very happy to say that Akademia, the institution of higher learning here in South Africa that is involved with the Solidarity movement, has started a great books program in which its students are encouraged to read the great books on which Western civilization has been founded. And this is what we are going to be talking about today. The great books of Western civilization, what some of these great books are, and then there's one great book in particular that we will be discussing in more detail, which is the Odyssey by Homer. And here to discuss this with us today is Daan Goosen. Daan is a lecturer at Akademia and he is also in charge of the Great Books program. Daan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast. So to start, why a Great Books program? Obviously, in my introduction, I have made very clear that I think it's a very good idea. But why do you think it's a good idea, or it's important to have a Great Books program?
Well, it pays my salary. So, Akademia has had a long history. And friendship with a few liberal arts colleges in America. Hillsdale College comes to mind immediately. And all of these colleges have a core curriculum in common, which is usually a great books program. And at Akademia, we focus not just on educating students to the best of our abilities, but also to form our students. And when we say form our students, we mean that we want to show students how the different disciplines of university interact, how they are interconnected, and also that there is a shared history, a shared philosophical basis to all the disciplines at a university. And the best way to do that, we think, and I think colleges like Hillsdale would also agree, is through a Great Books program, which introduces students to the great thinkers of the Western tradition, and to also those fundamental questions about what it means to be a human being, which specific disciplines like say biology or physics or math only touch elements on. But a great book like the Odyssey, for example, confronts us with questions which we all ask sometime in our lives, whether that be consciously or subconsciously.
I have gone on my own journey in terms of the great books. Several years ago, I took a decision that I want to read the great books of Western civilization. And to be very frank, I'm still busy reading the great books because there's not a fixed list. I started out thinking, well, maybe there are 10 books. If you read these 10 books, these are the great books of Western civilization. But it turns out that it's not quite that easy to make a list of the great books. So when you talk about the great books, do you have a particular list in mind? Do you have a particular number? Or do you work with criteria? Or how do you decide if a book is a great book, to use this term?
That's a very important question, because I think there's been a debate, I would say, for 100 years now about what the great books are. Some people take a more monolithic stance and say these are the 50 books or 100 books or 10 books that constitute the great books. On the other side of the divide, there are people who say that a great book is only specific to a certain time or culture or place, so each time and period produces its own great books. So it's almost the dichotomy between the rock and the river. You know, it's no sort of balance between them. What we are trying to do is look at the great books as a long conversation that has been started 3,000 years ago and which is ongoing. And that is sort of the criteria which we use. Some books are unavoidable. You can't avoid Homer, but we can also say that Homer has been corrected in this conversation by Socrates or Plato, Aristotle, and they have been corrected again by Augustine and Aquinas, and they have been corrected again as time goes on. So what we also tell our students when we introduce them to this program is that we are introducing them to a conversation more than we are introducing them to a library. To say, you don't have to start from scratch with every question you have. There are people much wiser than you who have already attempted and answered these questions. But if we say a list, I think you can't move past Homer. There are a few Latin writers, Virgil, you can't move past. Dante, you can't ignore. You can't ignore Milton. There are few things I think that one should treat monolithically. But then there's also open to interpretation. The Americans, for example, they read Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We would read...
Geknelderland, probably.
Exactly,
yes.
Yeah. Or I think even more modern, we can say The Feast of the Uninvited, or something in that line. So it is...
Raka also.
Raka, yeah.
Yeah.
It is culturally dependent as well, I think. As an Afrikaner, there are certain books in our tradition which is very important, which are our own great books.
Yes.
But there are certain standards which still need to be looked at.
So before we get to Homer, which is one of the oldest great books, I'm sure you've had this discussion with people before as well. This tendency or a concern. Let me express it from my perception or frame of reference. I sometimes get concerned when I talk with people or hear about people who are really keen readers, but they only read books that have just been published. So they look for some book that was just published in America or in England or wherever, and they read this and they attach a lot of value to this or weight to this, which is obviously a good thing or could potentially a good thing. But the difference to me between reading a book that has just been published as opposed to one that has been published 2,000 years ago or 500 years ago is, the one has withstood the test of time. The book that was just published might be amazing now, but in 5 years it could be a forgotten book because it hasn't made much of a contribution. And so there's this tendency today to read current affairs books and modern books, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't read them, but if you read those books and you forget about the old books, then it might be a problem. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what happens with time, the best gets sort of distilled. We know, for example, that there are other Homeric poems that have been written that just didn't get passed down. It's sort of also as if time told us that the two best poems of Homer was the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we sort of lost the others. I tell the students on a regular basis that if you think about 70s rock, for example, you think of Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath or whatever, but that's also been distilled as the greatest. There are hundreds of bands that were popular or made music in the 70s, which we just don't know anymore. And I think
they didn't stand the test of time. Yeah.
And that's just about 50 years ago now. So
well, just another example. I recently read a foreword to The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien that was written for a later edition. And what struck me about that was how much time he spends responding to criticism. So when The Lord of the Rings, which is today regarded as one of the great novels of the last century, was published, it received a lot of criticism. And I don't think people at the time knew that this is one of the great novels. Only through time did people really discover, in a sense, the significance of this book.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's bring this now to Homer. So Homer, you mentioned, wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. That was hundreds of years, centuries before Aristotle and Socrates. So we think of Socrates as the founder of Western philosophy, but Socrates himself thought of himself as someone who has inherited this great tradition that he is only carrying forward. He certainly didn't think of himself as the founder of something, but he had his own unique approach. But it's significant, firstly, to say that there's quite a lot of time that has passed between the publishing of the story of Troy, the Trojan Wars, as it was published written in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then Odysseus' return home. and Aristotle, so far that from an Afrikaner perspective, we can say the difference between us and the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck, or from an American perspective, America today and the Declaration of Independence. So is it accurate to say that Homer was one of the most important founders of Western civilization, or how would you describe him? How would you place him in this discussion?
I would say you can't understand the Western mind without understanding Homer. There are a few tendencies within the Western imagination that is so Homeric, and especially the tradition that came out of Homer, that you can't separate the two. Let me just give you one example of that. The Americans usually say they have a great love for the underdog, and that comes from, I think, Homer's explicit or implicit bias towards the Trojans, or not towards the Trojans, but actually against the Greeks.
In favor of the Trojans.
In favor of the Trojans.
Yes.
And then that line, being in favor of the defeated, gets taken through to the Romans, who claim their ancestry from the Trojans.
Yes.
The idea that one is self-critical is a Homeric ideal as well. Not necessarily as something that you see in his characters, but in the way that the two epics speak to one another. The Odyssey is critiquing the Iliad. The hero of Odysseus is critiquing Achilles. It's a sort of it's very reflective as well, and I think that's a key Western idea or inherent to the Western mind. We're always evaluating, trying to see, but what have we done there? That's wrong. We should not do that again. Or it's sort of that self-reflection that you find in Homer. When Aristotle writes his Politics, he's constantly referencing Homer as well. When Plato writes a Republic, he's constantly saying this part of Homer should be redacted, or this is good, or this is bad. So you can't think about Western civilization without Homer.
Okay, maybe to take a step back for the viewers or the listeners who are not entirely sure about the Iliad and the Odyssey, give us your quick overview of the difference between the two. What is the Iliad and what is the Odyssey? And then you can also explain why did you choose the Odyssey as one of the great books? Why, for example, not the Iliad? And why? And then we can talk about why the Odyssey is so important.
The Iliad, or I saw recently on the internet now, it's called the Troy story. So it's quite interesting. But the Iliad is a war story. So it's about the rage of Achilles. That's one of the opening words in the whole epic. The rage of Achilles and the will of Zeus. And I would say, in that sense, I don't think the appeal to our student body is going to be that broad. It's a very blood and guts story about the will of this demigod trying to avenge his pride and then eventually the death of his friend. So it's a complex tale. It's much longer than the Odyssey as well. So I think for students to go through it, it's a bit more intense. And a lot of people get lost in book 2 when Homer starts listing all the ships and all the people coming. People just give up after that. But we chose the Odyssey, I think, because
so let me just before we go. So the Iliad is the story of Troy.
Yeah.
This is maybe not the best way to explain it, but the movie people know about Troy with Brad Pitt
yeah.
and Eric Bana. That's at least not the entire Iliad, or the Iliad is particular sections of, but that's the story of the Greek invasion of Troy.
I think it would be better to say it's a story about Achilles. It's about this demigod and his will and urges and anger and the way in which
his refusal to fight.
Yes, his initial refusal to fight, and then when he fights, it's just this absolute mass. He even fights a river at a point.
Yeah.
It's irrational rage that gets hold of him. And it makes a very specific point regarding the will of the gods, the fatalistic view of the world that the Greeks had. I think it's incredibly interesting and a very deep book. I don't want to say anything against it. But the Odyssey is about going home after the war. So there's a lot of things.
That's the story of Odysseus.
Odysseus returning. And Odysseus, after we can say spoilers, but if you haven't read the book, it's 3,000 years ago, which had happened, so it doesn't really matter now.
Yeah, I think we can spoil the ending. Yeah.
When Achilles dies, when he doesn't die in the Iliad, there's sort of these intertextual myths and stuff that happens between. But when he dies, Odysseus essentially takes charge of the whole assault against Troy, and it's every time they need something, Odysseus gets it, or anytime something needs to be done, he does it, and he eventually causes the city to be destroyed and taken. And the Odyssey is about him getting home. And there's a lot of different things that happen in the Odyssey, I think, which a student body or any student can relate to more. It's about the crisis at home without proper authority in your community. It's about the gap left by father figures or brothers. It's about the struggles also of women, actually, to a large degree. It's about the way in which you should treat your guests or how you should treat strangers. It's much more thematically deep, I think, and obviously people will disagree with me, than the Iliad. So we thought it had a much broader, it spoke to much more people than the Iliad, and that's why we chose it.
It's also a bit more accessible and easier to read.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the reasons why this book is so significant? Maybe you can elaborate on some.
I think, and this is borrowed from Patrick Deneen and his a PhD dissertation which he wrote about the Odyssey. He drew a fascinating line or a similarity between how Aristotle defines human beings and what happens in the Odyssey. Now, if we could just sort of explain that a bit. Aristotle says that man as a political animal, or humanity as political animals, occupy the strange middle point between the gods and animals. He says that he who is without a polis, or we can say a community, is either a god or a man, but essentially not a human being. So if you're without a community, without a sense of belonging to a home, you're not a human being. And
so having a home is part of the essence of being a human being.
Absolutely. And Aristotle then does something spectacular. He says in that part of the Politics, he explicitly quotes Homer, and he says, like those homeless people, Homer so despised, or something in that line. So it's directly speaking to each other, these texts, that great conversation of the great books. And Odysseus comes before these choices during his ventures home. He can choose to become either something less human, becoming more like an animal. We can reference the meeting with the lotus eaters there, for example. You can sort of this drug addicted life. You become less human. They don't live in community. He can go that route, or he can stay on Calypso's island. She's a goddess, and he can become immortal and live with her. Or, and this is a third choice, which Deneen doesn't really highlight, but you could become a different human. You could marry the princess of the Phaeacians, Nausicaa, and he could abandon his Greek identity and become this sort of abstract human, living in this sort of paradisal human condition. And yet he still chooses to go home, to his own home. And that's sort of romantic in itself, but he knows at home there are 118 people occupying his home, and he's got to sort that problem out. So if we use that Aristotelian categories of neither God nor animal, but human, Odysseus fits that bill, but he does something more. He chooses his own community and his own people, his own home. And one can actually say that his whole venture is just to sleep in his own bed again, which he himself made. There's a beautiful description of it, how he sort of made it from a living olive tree. So the bed is both man-made but also natural. So it's a weird combination.
If I could just interject there, I think it's one of the first chapters in one of these dialogues. Someone talks about his home, not Odysseus' home. He talks about the valleys and the grass fields and how the horses are grazing. And then Odysseus says that my home of Ithaca doesn't have that. We don't have these grass fields with the horses, but my home is still more beautiful to me, even though we don't have this thing that you are boasting about. So there's this longing and this view of your own home as the most beautiful place that you and the place that you want to be, and that's why he decides to go back.
Also, traditionally, Odysseus didn't want to go to war. They had to sort of trick him, or not trick him. They had to rally him a lot to get him to go to the Trojan War. The story goes that when King Agamemnon came to summon him, he pretended to be mad by ploughing with a cow and a horse and sowing salt in his own fields. And only when they put his baby boy in front of the plough did he stop, and say, okay, fine, I'm not mad, I'll go. But the tradition holds Odysseus, well, one segment of the tradition sees Odysseus as the paradigmatic emblem of the hero who wants to go home, who treasures home above all else.
Mm. But so then in this journey there are many fantastical events, like him in the cave with the Cyclops, with the giants, and the journey through Scylla and Charybdis, the sea monsters. So if the story is about him going home, why all these really outer worldly events that he has to go through?
If we can just mention that Scylla and Charybdis scene, I think, and Aristotle also mentions this, when Aristotle describes virtues, he says it's obviously the golden mean between two extremes. And but Aristotle also says that you should veer to the higher one, or the one of less danger between the two. And that's exactly the advice Odysseus gets when he's told he has to sail between these two dangers.
Yeah.
Sail to
so Scylla is the sea monster with, was it 9 heads or something?
Yes.
And then Charybdis was the whirlpool, and he has to sail between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he discovers he cannot go through the middle. He has to go
veer
closer to the sea monster, otherwise his entire ship will be...
Aristotle says when you have two opposing vices to the virtue, it's very difficult to get to the golden mean, but veer to the vice which is less bad than the other one. So it's quite interesting how those two align as well. The fantastical elements of the text, I think there are some critics who say that that's just a fabrication of Odysseus' own head, because he is also known as a liar and he is quite deceitful. Yes. I don't like that critique. I think you should take the text at face value, and if Odysseus said he battled with the Cyclops, then that's what's happened. But I think, as usual with these more mythical stories, those extremes, those monsters, are always ways of reflecting the human condition back to humanity in a strange way. For example, the scene with the Cyclops, I think, is the changing point in his career, as one could say, or the changing point in the text, because he does a few things, Odysseus himself, which are considered sins in that culture. For example, he enters a house or the cave of the Cyclops without the Cyclops inviting him in or even being there. Then he demands gifts from the Cyclops. Because he's now the guest, he should receive gifts. And for that he's punished. He loses 6 men, I think, in the process. And then the Cyclops, often Odysseus blinds the Cyclops and he escapes brilliantly. The Cyclops tells him, I have wronged you, I know I've done wrong and I'm sorry, but because you have also attacked me, your host, you will either not get home, or when you get home, you will get home alone, which is a great problem for him because there's 118 people left waiting for him in his house who wants to take it from him. So having an army at your back would have been quite helpful. But this whole idea of guest friendship is vital to the whole text. And that whole scene with the Cyclops demonstrates that Odysseus, this young war hero, just coming from the Trojan War, was still following that way of Achilles, the sort of conquering hero, entering this cave. Look at me, I'm the hero, give me gifts, I deserve your praise, and he doesn't get it. And then he also sins against the guest friendship relationship, and that gets him punished.
Yes. Yeah. So there's also this theme of hubris and the danger of hubris. So that part of the story ends where he sticks the Cyclops' eye out and he runs out. And then as he goes towards his ship, I think he's on his ship, and then he turns back and he says to the Cyclops, "Go and tell everyone you know that the man who has defeated you is called Odysseus." But he doesn't know that the Cyclops is the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. And so he's screaming this at the Cyclops while he's driving, his ship is steering into the ocean. And then the Cyclops tells his father, which is Poseidon, so he gets into a storm. And so there's this whole thing also of hubris. The moment you start to think too much of yourself, you start to think that you have too much power, that's when things turn out badly for you.
And he gets cut down to size more and more. And at the end, he returns to his house as a beggar, which I think is I would say it's the accidental discovery of the virtue of humility, which I think the Greeks sort of discovered and then sort of ignored. But it's incredibly interesting, especially when you contrast Odysseus with Achilles, who's nothing but prideful. There was never this moment in the Iliad where he can be cut down. Yes. He gives in at the end. He gives up Hector's body, obviously, at the end, but he hasn't been shaved down like Odysseus has, step for step. And eventually, I think the main point where that hubris turns on Odysseus is when he accepts his own mortality, when he knows that if I go home, I'm going to die like any other man. And that's, I think, where that.
So let's talk about the ending of the book, and considering that it's a several thousand years old book, we can talk about the ending. So it's a strange ending in the sense that he goes back, like you said, as a beggar. He's also he pretends to be someone. He isn't to the extent that he's unrecognizable. Eventually, he's discovered, and there's the whole story with the old bow that he has to get, and he then eventually shoots with the bow, and then it's discovered who he is, and then it's a bloody mess after that. So, but why is this important? Is it not just some fantastical story? Can we learn something from a story like this?
I think once again we should try and always keep the Iliad as just in the back of our minds, because if you take Achilles, he's this big war hero, and it's always the most extreme violence that comes from him, especially in those later parts.
And he just defeats everyone.
And he's just massacres. It's terrible. And what I think Homer is saying is that Achilles is fighting for his own pride and for his own the restoration of his own pride and dignity. Whereas when Odysseus kills the suitors, it's something different happening there. Although he embodies Achilles to a certain extent in that scene, he's doing it for his own home. It's not for the pride you win in war. It's not to conquer or take back or the loot from the bodies of the people you've killed. It's something more fundamental. And I think what we should always, as I said earlier, the two texts are in conversation with one another. And Homer's trying to say that this war on Troy was stupid. And the whole Greek tradition says, Herodotus as well says...
And he's saying this as a Greek.
As a Greek.
Yes.
Herodotus as well, a few hundred years later, says it's absolutely stupid that you would go to war about people stealing wives, Homer's critiquing this expansionistic war and saying it's the whole root of it was a bad idea. But when you fight for something that is truly worth fighting for, like your own home, then that type of anger and rage is necessary. I think that is the basic idea which Homer is putting forward. Now, we can obviously debate if that's good or not, but I think that's what the two texts are telling us.
So maybe this is a controversial remark, and maybe this video will get flagged, but there's an element in this story of saying that sometimes violence is necessary or violence is justifiable. Like when your house has been invaded and you need to protect your house, or you need to protect your wife and your children. So there's an element of that as well.
We can sort of save that type of idea by saying this is sort of the start of the just war theory in the Western world, that you have to be able to justify an attack or an assault using strict criteria. Is your wife endangered? Because Penelope's life was imminently in danger. Once again, 118 men in their house trying to take her, essentially. His son was being threatened. They were plotting they're making all these plans to murder him on a constant basis. There's reason for him to
be violent.
To be violent.
Yes.
Now we can obviously we can stand back, especially after 2,000 years of Christianity, and say, well, was that violence just? And I think that's a big thing we should ask ourselves, because Patrick Deneen also says in his book about the Odyssey that both of the epics of Homer end tenuously on a just note. But I think we can only say it ends tenuously on a just note after 2,000 years of Christianity, in which justice has always been linked with mercy. To the pre-Christian pagan world, what's happened there, that's justice, because the proper order has been restored, the one who's been given, whose rights have been assaulted has been rectified, so justice has been done. But only after 2,000 years of Christianity, where we struggle to separate justice from mercy, exactly asking the point, is violence ever permitted or necessary? That's exactly a Christian frame of mind that does that. To a Greek, a pre-Christian pagan Greek, that's
obviously,
absolutely,
yes.
yeah, it's natural. But what is quite interesting at that point is that the gods intervene to stop further injustice. They intervene to stop further violence. There's a point after he's reconquered his own home, where he has to flee to the hills again, to his father's house, because he knows the families of the suitors are now going to come after him. And in those pre-Christian pagan cultures, vengeance is typical.
Yes.
You kill my brother, I kill your brother, and so we go on until no one has anything left. And just at the point when Odysseus and the families of the suitors are going to come into conflict, Zeus sends a thunderbolt and the conflict stops, which is also quite strange, sort of this peace.
I think he says something like, you have killed enough of your own people.
Yeah,
or,
yeah.
So there's also an element like an argument about civil war, and about how many of your own people can you actually kill before it's before it's too bad. But that's quite significant that he went there, inflicted violence, and then when the violence continued, he was stopped. He was prevented from continuing.
And quite interestingly as well, thematically, because Odysseus has learned restraint throughout his journeys, and I think that's all the encounters with the monsters and all the things, he learns restraint from that. As you pointed out, the Cyclops shouting, "I'm Odysseus, I defeated you," until the point where he comes home as a beggar. And one would have thought that at the end he wouldn't want to fight anymore, but the gods have to stop him. He was really about to act like Achilles again, and that in the final scenes he was going to slaughter them, So it's a complex character we're dealing with, Odysseus.
So just before we end the conversation, how do we then deal with a book like this? How do we, if you're a student studying at a university or an institution of higher learning and you have to read a book like the Odyssey, it's a bit difficult to reach these type of conclusions that we've been discussing now if you just sit there in your study room reading the book. How do you think, and this is just one example of a great book, but how do you think a book like this ought to be approached by a student, by a young person or an older person, someone who's interested in this?
I think the best place to start is to form a small book club and say a few friends come together and we for each week for a few months we're going to read one chapter, and then just discuss the character. Odysseus is such a complicated character. Some people hate him, some people love him. Just discuss the characters, especially with literature. In those discussion, themes start to emerge, and you sort of start to see, oh, okay, he was prideful here, but now next week he's less prideful. She said that he's not in that conversation. I think that's very essential. And then also, it's so difficult with this book because there's no standard commentary you can read or something. But a good introductory preface to the book is always good to read. The cheapest version you can buy in South Africa has got it's a Samuel Butler translation, which I highly recommend. It reads very easily. It's got a fantastic introduction, which takes you through all the complicated web of gods and the structures of the mythology, and that really helps to put one on course and tell you what to look for, what themes to watch out for. And then on a final note on that, I would say that be very careful when you read the text of the patterns that repeat. Because it's a poem, there are certain phrases that repeat constantly. Rosy-fingered dawn came, or there's all these types of repetitive phrases. When they change, when suddenly the rosy-fingered dawn, that something shifts, you have to be attentive, something's happening. Homer's telling you, watch, something's now at play, which isn't usually the case. Yeah. And in that sense, because it's a poem, that repetition, when you're reading it, you immediately feel, no, something's wrong now, something's changed. And then you're more attentive to maybe what's transpiring.
To try to read between the lines and figure out what's happening, yeah. Well, thank you, Daan Goosen. Thank you for coming in and having this wonderful conversation. And
thank you very much.
I hope that we'll be talking about many other great books in the future as well.
Thank you very much, Ernst. It was an absolute pleasure being here. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ernst Roets. If you support this podcast and the work that we are involved with as the Afrikaner Foundation and the broader solidarity movement in South Africa, I want to encourage you to become a more active supporter. You can do this first and foremost by subscribing to our various social media channels, by leaving a comment and sharing what you have seen. But other than that, also by making a small monthly contribution to the work that we are doing through the Afrikaner Foundation's website, or by making a once-off donation. Links in the description.